So has Keir Starmer done enough to oppose the government? And you don't need to have Keir Starmer opposing everything the government did. You don't need to have him opposing, for instance, lockdown to protect the NHS, if indeed that's what he believes, and that is him believing government policy when it comes to that. But what I feel that we haven't had is scrutiny. What are the cost-benefit analysis when it comes to the number of people saved from COVID and saved via the NHS not being strained versus the number of people who might die or be seriously affected by mental health or an economic downturn? I would like to know more scrutiny from Sir Keir Starmer when it comes to coming out of lockdown. When are we going to? What's the plan? What is the plan for unlocking the UK? Why can't it be brought forward? That doesn't mean you're against lockdown. That doesn't mean you have to betray the policy itself. But what I feel we've been lacking is the kind of questions that give you and I confidence. And that's allowed conspiracy theories to grow. And I'll actually include a lot of journalists in that as well. You don't need to be against the direction of travel to be able to scrutinise the direction of travel. And there has been too little of that, in my opinion. I think we're in the most strange situation at the moment where we have a Prime Minister who is so dishonest we've no idea what he thinks, and we've a Labour leader who's so scared to give us an idea of what he thinks. We're in this political vacuum of nothingness. Well, before we speak to Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked Online, and James Mills, the former Labour advisor to Debate List, let's hear Keir Starmer being told to leave the Raven pub.
That man is not allowed in my pub. Get out of my pub. Go on. Calm yourself down. Get out of my pub. Calm down.
Sorry, can you keep out the way?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I can't.
So that's him being told to leave. He also went on as well, which we might get this audio where Mr. Humphreys says that Sir Keir hasn't provided any kind of opposition whatsoever. Well, Brendan O'Neill is the editor of Spiked Online and James Mills is the former Labour advisor. They both join me live via video link. Evening to you both.
Hello.
I will start with you, James, because, of course, Sir Keir told to leave the Raven. Mr. Humphreys went on to say that he has not provided any kind of opposition, went on to try and give some facts and stats about the age of the average person that dies from COVID. I mean, it's a fair point, isn't it, that agreeing with the government on the concept of lockdown, which was, of course, Sir Keir and Labour's policy, that doesn't mean you can't provide scrutiny about how the government came to those conclusions, about the number of people that might die versus the number of people that might be saved, the way we're going to come out of lockdown, the kind of scrutiny that gives us the answers that we need.
I mean, there's a lot there to unpack, Cristo, but I mean, fundamentally, this chap was a half owner of the pub. I think the other owner disagreed with him and said his views didn't share what the actual Raven believed and didn't think that, and was actually embarrassed by what this guy did. And to be totally honest with you, I mean, I think most reasonable-minded people saw that clip and thought, this guy's a bit rude and slightly unpleasant. And that's before you get to what he was talking about. I mean, he's tried to play down the deaths of elderly people. I mean, I find that quite abhorrent, to be totally honest with you. And he's also factually incorrect. And so he was pushing a lot of sort of lockdown myths and sort of conspiracy theories. So, no, I thought Keir Starmer was right to disagree with him. In fact, I mean, I would have given him a lot more short shrift and wouldn't spend less time with him. And as I say, he didn't even reflect the view of the pub, only half of it. And most of the general public would agree with Keir Starmer and not this individual.
In what way I mean, he was factually accurate that the average age of death when it comes to COVID is something like, I think, 82 and a half, and that the average age of death in general in this country is around the same. That's not playing down deaths, is it?
Yeah, but it is if you're trying to pretend that the fact that no one else gets COVID, that's not true. Around 10,000 people of under 65s have got it. The idea that this is not a pandemic that's killing people and also...
he didn't say that. He was acknowledging the pandemic existed by talking about the people who died from it.
Well, you don't use those stats and facts and figures unless you're trying to play down the deaths of the pandemic. Let's be serious. Why else would you have used them?
Well, because
Why do you
he was
think
trying to make a point about vulnerable people. He was trying to make a
Yeah,
point
and
about the
what, and
people
what was
who were
his
most
point?
vulnerable.
And what was his point?
That-
What was his point? Only
essen-
elderly people die, and their life is not valuable compared to others.
No, he was making a point about the fact that the elderly
And
people who die
yeah,
from COVID
take that
are of
point
the
to its
same age
conclusion.
of the average
Take that
people who
point to its
die.
conclusion. Take that point to its conclusion that therefore that they're most at risk for it, they die, and therefore their life doesn't matter. That's the point he was trying to make, and compared to his loss financially.
All right,
Now,
Brett,
I think that's morally not correct. You've got to respect the fact that most studies, all the evidence have showed that even people who are dying from COVID in that age bracket would on average have lived 10 years longer. Does their 10 years of life not matter? And if he has any problems with the support given to people suffering economically from this case, it should be with the government, not the leader of the opposition. And lastly, I'll answer your point on Keir Starmer. To be fair to Keir Starmer, I'm not a supporter. I didn't vote for him as Labour leader, but the man has tried to oppose the government and support it where need be. On the bill where the lockdown bill that came through, that was wrapped together with support measures. He couldn't amend it. He had to support or not support it. He has raised things like COVID passports. He's also only this week, I think in the last few days, asked the Prime Minister not to take his trip to India. I mean, there are things which... All right.
I take those points. So, Brendan, let me bring you in on this. Therefore, the pub landlord was trying to play down these COVID deaths by just concentrating on the vulnerable. Many of those could have had 10 years further of life. The pandemic itself was being played down by that, and Sir Keir has opposed or questioned certain things that have been outlined in Parliament. What would you say to that?
I thought Keir Starmer came off terribly in that exchange, and the most shocking thing for me was the way this pub landlord was being manhandled by Keir Starmer's bodyguard or police detail or whatever it was. I mean, to brutalize someone in their own place of work, that, you know, he is the landlord, co-landlord of this pub. James is putting faces. Maybe he's in favour of ordinary people being attacked for daring to speak ill towards a politician. But in a democracy,
I think if random strangers run screaming and shouting at anyone, especially a politician, at fear of life and their death, the personal security officer that should step in to protect them. Yes, I think that's quite
all right.
normal.
Go on, Brendan.
If right, you heard it from the horse's mouth. If a member of the public shouts and accosts an elected politician, then they should be manhandled and silenced.
If
I think
you
that's really
charge
shocking,
down,
and that's the most...
James, Brendan, let you speak uninterrupted. And Brendan, isn't the point here that actually he wasn't sort of calmly addressing Sir Keir? He was actually being quite aggressive in the way he was being questioned. That might not, and I accept that might not justify being manhandled, but he wasn't coming across sort of calmly and rationally, was he?
Not everyone is calm and rational. You know, people are different. And I find it shocking that the idea that in a democracy you would not be allowed to speak loudly and passionately at an elected politician. That's what's most shocking about this incident. That doesn't mean I agree with everything that this landlord said. I certainly don't. And I do actually think there was an element where he was playing down the seriousness of the deaths of older people. I think that's true. But he should be allowed to speak. And that's the most shocking thing here. But I think he's right. He was right to say that the Labour leader has not offered any serious opposition or scrutiny to lockdown, which is really shocking because lockdown, as we know, has harmed working class communities and poor people far more than wealthy people. The middle classes have had an expansion of their savings. The billionaire classes have done extraordinarily well from lockdown, whereas working people and poorer people have lost out enormously. And as for people in the developing world, the impact on them of the lockdown is going to be catastrophic. So the fact that the Labour Party, a party that was supposed to represent the working classes, but of course it doesn't, the fact that it hasn't even tried to raise these serious questions of the economic effects of lockdown really demonstrates that it is now just a hyper-middle-class party that doesn't really have anything to say to ordinary people.
But isn't there a question there of them not being able to do right for doing wrong, or vice versa? Because if they were then to start scrutinising the government in that way, if they were then to start asking that questions, they would then be immediately branded by the media, by people who are anti-Labour, as lockdown sceptics, as playing down the pandemic, as not taking deaths seriously enough, whereas in a time of national crisis, isn't an opposition that supports the direction of travel that the government is in the most important thing?
Well, I noticed that James yawned when I mentioned the working classes, which is quite revealing.
No, I didn't.
About
Hey,
the
whoa, whoa,
contemporary
hey,
middle
hold the
class.
phone
But the
here.
thing
Hang on,
is,
excuse
Okay,
me, excuse me.
you did.
You're talking.
mentioned the
No, no,
working
no, no,
class
no. Wait, Brendan,
very
excuse me. Can I
ostentatiously
remind you who you're talking to?
because
One
the
second,
Labour
hold the
Party
phone.
does not
I'm
want
not
to hear
taking some.
about working
I'm not
class people.
taking. Look, I'm not taking some spit, some like insult from some two-bit like hack. Right? I'm a kid from a council estate, a single-parent family. I grew up. I'm first generation
Well,
at
stop
university.
yawning when
I'm from.
people talk about the
I'm
working
not.
classes.
I'm
I know
sorry. I'm sorry,
they're an
Brendan.
inconvenience to your
I am
party.
from the working classes. I don't need some posh boy staying up late at night who can't shave properly to tell me about the working classes. Thank you very much.
All right, can the two of you just wind it down a little bit? We're all adults here.
The working class from some jumped up little like hack.
Well, okay, I think you've made the point about hack. Brendan, you've made the point about yawning. Can we try and get back to the direction?
I was yawning at how boring his arguments are.
Well, that's quite rude, James, and it's quite rude for you to.
Honest, I don't remember yawning, to be totally honest. But if I was, it's probably because how boring he is. Because all he comes out of is mad conspiracy theories. At the end of the day, the simple fact is that he's equally wrong. He was saying that Keir Starmer doesn't want to put forward policies to oppose some of the measures coming in from the economic hit of lockdown. That's not true. I'm not even support Keir Starmer, and I don't think he's doing that. He's come out and he's opposed what the government are doing when they're going to pull back the UC cuts. He's called for more support for businesses. He's called more support for
yeah, but he's not scrutinised the direction that we are going in. He's not scrutinised whether lockdown itself is the right decision. He's not scrutinised. So yeah, but that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. That doesn't mean you can't then say, well, okay, we agree with the concept of lockdown. However, and then ask a question about whether the deaths are being tracked properly, about whether the testing is actually appropriate, about when lockdown might actually end, about the cost-benefit analysis. There are all sorts of...
There's several different issues there, if you don't mind, Cristo, that you complaining with here. It's hard for me to break down all of them. But to go quickly through a couple, right? Look, you're saying he hasn't pushed back on aspects of lockdown. That's not true. But also, there's a big debate over whether or not there's a really serious debate whether you want to support lockdown or not. Some people, especially like Brendan, are opposed to it. Look, I am someone I agree with Keir Starmer. He agrees with all the evidence that suggests that lockdowns are the best way to tackle the pandemic to stop it from to end transmission. All the evidence suggests this is true. Keir Starmer supports it. If you've got a problem with the economic problems that come from pandemic, well, from the lockdowns rather, you're assuming therefore that you're not going to have economic problems from just letting it rip, which is not true. And if you look at Brazil and Sweden, you've seen that. All right,
okay,
but the lockdown was to stop transmission to tackle the pandemic.
Okay, all right, James, that's enough. Brendan, you were actually in the middle of an answer when that sort of kicked off. So
he was smearing me, to be fair.
Well, and you smeared him back about his beard, and so I think we're all quits now, aren't we? And so, well, James, you're not helping matters. Brendan, you were in the middle of an answer about Labour not being able to do right for doing wrong, and as you have just heard, James has come up with some examples of where Sir Keir has opposed the government. What do you have to say about those?
Well, the point I was making is that Labour is now an anti-working class party, which seems to me to be an undeniable fact. And this, just to broaden it out slightly, I mean, firstly, the idea I'm a posh boy, I'm the son of working class Irish immigrants. Just because I speak the way I speak doesn't mean you should make those kind of assumptions. And I grew up in a council house as well, which my father bought under Thatcher, which I know in the eyes of the middle classes who have taken over the Labour Party, that makes us class enemies. But the point I would make is very simple, just to broaden this out.
The question. Let him finish, James. Let him finish.
The question of Keir Starmer's year as leader and whether he's made any impact and whether he has successfully held the government to account and employed scrutiny against them. He clearly hasn't. And he hasn't made any inroads back into the red wall vote areas. He hasn't won back any of those voters' trust. And it's very clear why that hasn't happened, because Labour is now utterly disconnected from the constituency it was founded to represent, which is the working classes. And the working classes will not forget what Keir Starmer did in relation to Brexit, for example. He was Labour's anti-Brexit leader for a long time. He was the man behind the second referendum, which would have entailed voiding the largest vote in the history of this country and voiding the votes of millions of working class people. So this is the kind of Labour Party we're talking about. They stab the working classes in the back. They don't raise serious questions about the economic impact of lockdown, and they don't hold the government to account in the way that they should. And it's the combination of all of those things that make people just distrust Labour under Keir Starmer.
I mean, just to throw this in, the Conservative lead, which I find staggering under Boris Johnson, frankly, is now, the latest poll, I think, was 9 points. The largest we've seen since May 2020. I mean, taking your points on board, James, whether there has been some unfairness in the way Sir Keir is being represented when it comes to the scrutiny he's been holding the government under, Brendan does have a point in as much as it's not cutting through. It's not cutting through in our consciousness, and it's not cutting through when it comes to the actual polls. And so something's not connecting, is it?
No, I'm not going to try and defend the polling situation. It's quite clear that Labour needs to do better. There's loads of things that Brendan said there that I don't think is necessarily true. I mean, for argument's sake, I think the way Brendan's perceiving the working class, I disagree. Labour stabbing it in the back. I mean, working class kids like me, I don't know how old Brendan is, but working class kids like me were given leg ups and a leg up in society, not by Margaret Thatcher, but by a Labour government that got us through for the largest amount of us ever to get to secondary, let alone higher education and on further. And every economic independent research shows the last Labour government benefited people at the very bottom of society. So this idea of some sort of stab in the back myth to the working class, it's just not held up. And Brendan's view is a minority among working class people, from my experience, and I come from a working class background. And if we're going to talk about what happened in the polls and how it's measured, there's a debate about how badly Labour's doing among working class voters. It's not completely silenced and nailed down. It's up for debate. Where Labour is doing
the red
right
wall
now,
became a blue wall.
It's quite clear.
The red wall became a blue wall.
I live in the north of England, and the idea that the north of England is one homogenous area and it's exactly the same, and that everyone there is some sort of Wokington man, is just not true. Okay, I travel quite regularly around the north of England, so it's not. A lot of these stuff are people that live in the southeast that project this onto the north. To be totally honest with you, and I say this as someone who grew up in the south and live in the north, and I work and travel regularly around it. And my wife's from the north, so it's not as easy caricature what people like to perceive it to be. And if you actually look at, we actually hold the most seats anyway across the north of England, so more than Tories. So it's not necessarily true. And if you're asking me what Labour should do better, well, my opinion is that as someone who didn't vote for Keir Starmer, but I want the Labour leaders to do well, I want the Labour Party to win, I think he needs to project more of a vision, show more of an alternative about how we come out of lockdown, how the world is going to change, and how people like Brendan from the right of the political spectrum have spent most of their arguments about how we should decentralise, pull back and isolate and cut back many of the programmes and initiatives that benefit working class kids like me, and probably Brendan, if he says he's working class background, probably benefit from any of these schemes. So I'd actually like to see them better funded and more investment.
I mean, it sounds like, Brendan, you're sort of agreeing a little bit on there that Sir Keir isn't doing as well as he could do. Okay, James, I accept what you're saying, that you think that maybe the polling might be a little bit off, but what do you have to say to all of that, Brendan?
Just an extraordinary state of denial. You were an advisor to the Labour Party when it got the worst results since the 1930s. You can't live in denial.
You're actually you're wrong. The person in denial is you, because that's not true. That's not true. I wasn't. Brendan, I wasn't, so take that back, please. If you're going to misquote my CV, if you're going to quote my CV, at least get it right. So I wasn't an advisor then.
So let me correct it then. You were an advisor to the leader of the Labour Party, who subsequently went on to get the worst result for Labour since the 1930s. Yeah. There we go. And when I worked
for him, he got one of the best. He got the best rise of the vote since 1997. So if you're going to try and do ad hom stuff.
It's just incredible listening to this. The working classes have
turned their backs on Labour in historically
unprecedented. The working classes have turned their backs on Labour in historically unprecedented numbers. More working class people now vote for the Tories. They don't see Labour as their party anymore. And to me, it's perfectly understandable why they don't, because Labour has betrayed the working classes many times, not only recently, but historically as well. And I'm not from the right. I consider myself to be a Trotskyist, actually. So I'm anti-Labour from a left-wing perspective. And my view is that it's one thing to give...
I think you ghost these positions to justify that undeniable. I mean, like, the idea that you're from the left and the views you hold. I mean, you've described the working class right now. I've not heard you mention what is your depiction of the working class, man? I'd love to know, because I look at the working class, and you say young people today, many of them under 30, are paid very low amounts of money. Those people are voting Labour. There's people from very ethnic minority backgrounds. They're still voting large.
Not enough to win elections, though, James.
Well, you're asking someone whether we're doing one of the polls. I said I don't think we are, but Brendan's caricature of the working class for me.
Okay, well, but what do you mean by the working class in the way that you're perceiving it at the moment?
I have not said any description about the working class.
Yeah, so what do you mean?
Yeah.
The idea that I'm caricaturing them is just another smear. I'm talking about people.
Well, define them then, Brendan. Define them. What is the working class? Tell me what you.
Well, if you let him answer, I just asked him that question, so let him answer.
He was trying to avoid it.
The working classes are people who sell their labour. The kind of people I grew up with, the kind of people I associate with, the kind of people I'm related to, the kind of people who have stopped voting for Labour because it treats them like crap. That's the working class. So
basically,
the
people
point I'm
know.
making is now you can talk about the under 30s and the kind of metropolitan under 30s.
Do they not sell their labour?
Who are often on poor wages and who are often based in cities. That's not a real constituency, and you know it's not a real constituency because you're talking about generationalism, whereas I think what's more important...
What is Brendan on
All right, well,
here?
listen, this will have to be an argument that we continue another day. I'm not sure we got many answers, but it was entertaining nonetheless.